Hello Year 9, this is Mrs Kennedy. For this lesson I'm going to be taking you through the poem War Photographer. The reason being is to revise it, as it was one that you would have looked at the very beginning of the year before all this lockdown happened. So it's good for us to look over it again. We also didn't want to try and teach you a brand new poem that we hadn't yet been able to cover in school in such a short space of time, so we've decided to go with one that you would have all seen before as a revision task. Now, as you can see, I've got a getting you thinking task on the first slide. I'd like you to just pause the video for about 2 minutes and have a go answering those two questions, and hopefully by the end you'll be able to develop on them further. Okay, so here is where I'm going to take you through context. Now, for all of your literature papers, you will need to understand the background of the piece and of the writer. It's also vital that you focus on important facts and not just any old facts that you find out about them. They need to link and be relevant. Okay, so here we have some for War Photographer, which I'll take you through now. So first of all, it was written by Carol Ann Duffy. Okay, and it was published in 1985 as part of her collection called Standing Female Nude. She is friends with Dan McCullum and Philip Jones Griffiths, two very well respected war photographers, and they were part of her inspiration to actually write this poem. She was interested in the photographer and the difficult decisions that they have to make in a war zone, so she was more focused on how it affected them and what they were able to do and what they weren't able to do in that particular situation and how it would affect them. It's about their dilemma rather than the photographs that they actually take. And in the poem they mention something called a dark room. Now I wanted to just go over what this is because some of you may not remember what a dark room is. So a dark room was used to develop photos from a reel of film. That is how photos were developed when this poem in particular was written. They didn't have the digital photos that we have today, so they would have used a dark room with solutions, and actually the room would have been red, as you can see in the image there. Okay, so all of these facts are relevant to her intention with the poem. It's all about the photographer rather than the photograph itself. Okay. Now, there's another little bit of context I would like to go over with you. In the poem, on line 12, they reference a famous photo by a war photographer called Nick Ut. He took a photo of a 9-year-old Vietnamese girl during the Vietnam War. The photo shows the girl running naked towards the camera in extreme pain. She'd torn her clothes off after being severely burned when her village was hit by napalm bombs. That is a bomb that is designed to set fires, okay, so it would have been extremely painful and would have been burning her at the time. The photo was published on the front page of the New York Times and won a Pulitzer Prize. Okay, and this photo is actually referenced within the poem. So this is another piece of context that is relevant and linked in well to the intention of the poet and the context of the poem. Okay, so here is where I'm going to take you through revising each stanza and what they were about and what the poet is trying to tell us. Okay, so we need to remind ourselves of what's happening in each stanza so that we can remember what the poet was trying to convey to us as her reader. So first of all, stanza 1, okay, this is the war photographer coming home and he's finally alone in his dark room getting ready to develop the photos that he has taken. And he then lists the places that he has been. So it says, in his dark room he's finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though he were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. So Belfast, Beirut and Phnom Penh are the places that he has been and taken photos from. So then we move on to stanza 2. He has a job to do, solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England home again, to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Okay, so here he's actually beginning to develop the photos now. and he's reminded of the contrast between the war zone that he has visited and taken photos in to rural England and the safety of home. So it's showing the difference between where he's been and had to take photos to where he is now and feels safe at home. Then we go on to stanza 3. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. A half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. Okay, so in this stanza, the picture is slowly beginning to develop. Okay, it's fading into view. During the process in the dark room, the photos would not be instant, so it would be very slowly and gradually coming into his view. It reminds him of the death of the man in the picture, and it's almost like he's reliving and rehearing the cries of that man's wife. Now, he wouldn't have been able to go and help or assist in any way because he is there to do his job of taking the photos. Okay, and he would hope that the coming home is when people would start to change their views and governments and things would start to help and stop all this violence. But he, in that moment, wouldn't have been able to go and help. So we have stanza 4, 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. Okay, so here it's talking about people back home in England and how they would be sad for a moment having seen the picture in the paper, but then they'll forget it and move on with their lives. Okay, almost as if it's not really making the impact that he hoped it would. Okay, it then ends with him going back out again on the aeroplane to other war zones to take more photos. So here you can say that it has a bit of a cyclical structure, goes round in a circle, because it starts with him coming home and then him going back out again, and then he'd return home and do more photos, and then he'd go back out again. So it's just a constant cycle for him. Okay, so now obviously with poetry there are many different techniques and things that you can pick out. However, that will take a very long time. So what I've done is I have, to help you with language, structure and form, I've colour-coded sections in the poem and made notes to go alongside them. I'm going to take you through this quickly as a reminder of the poet's use of these 3 elements and what they are trying to actually convey to us as the reader. Remember that there will be specific techniques that you could pick out, such as similes, metaphors, alliteration, repetition, etc. Okay, which we will go through a little bit later. Okay, but for now, I just want to take you through the general and kind of overview of what they use. So, starting with form. So that's in the little orange section. Okay, so this poem has 4 stanzas and they are all of equal length and regular rhyme scheme. As you can see, if you look at the first stanza, for example, the lines 2 and 3 rhyme together, and the last 2 lines rhyme together, and it's the same in each stanza. Okay, so it's a very regular rhyme scheme. It's set out in ordered rows, just like the photographer's spools, echoing the care that the photographer takes over his work. Okay, so it's very ordered, just like his photographs and the reels of film are. They use enjambment to reflect the gradual revealing of the photos as it develops, because remember, as I said, in a dark room the photos would not be instant. And each stanza has an end stop, meaning they have the full stop and it ends on the end of each stanza. Okay, again, kind of showing maybe that they want a bit more control, that they don't have that control, and they're kind of just having to go with the job. Okay, so we have structure in blue. So the poem follows the actions and thoughts of a photographer in his darkroom. There is a distinct change at the start of the 3rd stanza when the photographer remembers a specific death. In the final stanza, the focus shifts to the way the photographer's work is received. So he's talking about a very specific death of a man, and then at the end he starts to talk about the fact that yes, people will be upset, but only for a small amount of time, and therefore it's not necessarily making a difference. Then we have religious imagery in green. The references to religion make it sound almost as if the photographer is a priest conducting a funeral when he's developing the photos. This could be linked to the fact that many of the photos can be of people that have died. Okay, so it's like he's almost given them that final moment of remembrance. Okay, and it's almost like a ceremony for his actions. He's almost doing it in that way, maybe to help himself cope, but also just to remember those people who have lost their lives in their war zone. Now, I'm going to get you to pause for just 2 minutes before I go through the next three, so you can add any notes you'd like to your own poem. Okay, so hopefully you've added some notes from that section into your own poem, and now I'm going to move on to the next three sections. So we have contrast, which is in examples of this are shown in red. So it presents rural England, as I spoke about earlier, okay, and as a contrast to the war zones the photographer visits. So rural England here that we know is obviously very different to those kind of war zones that he's experiencing. The grieving widow that he mentions is compared with people in England whose eyes only prick with tears at the pain. Ironically, the photographer is detached in the war zone but deeply affected at home. So he talks about the cries of the man's wife when he took the photo, and then he talks about the people who will be upset for a moment in the final stanza and then completely forget and move on with their lives because it doesn't affect them and they can't actually do anything about it. Okay, and the problem is that the photographer themselves has to deal with those issues when they get home. They have to detach themselves in the war zone knowing they cannot help, but then when they come home they cannot forget either. So they don't really get a chance to detach themselves from it. It's constantly with them. Then we have emotive language in purple. The poem is full of powerful emotive imagery which reflects the horrors of what is seen by the photographer and captured in his photos. Like the photographer, Duffy tries to represent the true horror of conflict in her work in order to make the reader think about the subject. Okay, so all these different words that I've highlighted in purple are there just to show the true horror of what he is witnessing when out in those war zones. For example, the photo I told you about with the girl running in the nightmare heat from the napalm attack is real. You've got him witnessing the man, taking a photo of the man who died and explaining it as like a half-formed ghost. Okay, it's blood stained, there's agonies, and those agonies are shown in black and white. So the photographs themselves are portraying the agonies that he has witnessed in the war zones. Okay, then we talk about the idea of pain, detachment and anger. These are all different focuses in the poem. Okay, so pain is shown through the photographers depict real pain in 100 agonies, and there's also the emotional pain of the women who lose their husbands. Okay, the horrific pain of war is contrasted with the ordinary pain back home. So he kind of has to balance out what would be seen as a painful thing at home compared to the pain experienced in a war zone. Okay, obviously the war zone is worse, but people back home wouldn't necessarily accept that because they don't live it through it themselves. Detachment. The photographer is detached from his emotions in the war zone so he can do his job. The words finally alone and impassively suggest that he's also detached from ordinary life in England. Okay, so remember I said that they have to detach themselves from what they're witnessing in that moment and just take the photographs. And then you have anger shown in the poem. Okay, the poem ends with a sense of anger at the people who don't care about the suffering of others. Now, it could be that they don't care because it doesn't personally affect them. The photo's there and then it's gone, and then another photo comes and it all changes every time. So there isn't that prolonged kind of witnessing of it like the photographer has. Okay, again, what I'd like to do now is just pause for a couple of minutes, add any more notes to your own section of notes or poem before we move on to the next part. So what we are going to do is we're going to be doing some quotation explosions. Now, you'll need to go onto the school website to access the worksheet that we need for this section. So if you go to the school closure part and you go to Year 9, Power and Conflict Poetry, and then you need to go to the section called One Sheet Revision, which you can see I've circled here. You would then need to go to the one that is called War Photographer. Again, I've circled here to show you. Okay. You'll need to download this to be able to do the quotation explosions that I want you to do. Okay. Once you have that sheet, you need to go to this page as shown on the slide. Okay, and we are going to focus on this section as it gives us examples of 4 key quotations that are actually in this poem. We're going to look at 2 quotations in detail, these 2. Okay, the other 2 are just as important, but these are the 2 I've picked for this task. Okay, I'm going to talk you through my quotation explosion first before I get you to do your own. So what I have done first is I have picked the quotation of spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. I have identified which words or phrases I think are the most significant. So in this case, spools, suffering and ordered rows. Then I thought about techniques, word classes and things that have been used in this particular quotation. And I've put them around the side. But you can't just list different techniques that a poet has used within a quotation. You have to talk about the effect of that technique and what the quotation is actually trying to show us as a reader and what the poet wanted us to think and feel. So this is what I have done. So I'll read it through for you. So I picked out sibilance, and just a reminder, sibilance is the repetition of the S sound, so spools of suffering. Okay, so the sibilance continues the sombre tone, while the noun phrase of ordered rows suggests he detaches himself from the distressing subject matter and works in a cold, methodical way. So he has to kind of put this cold kind of stance on himself to keep himself detached from the situation that he's just been in when the photos start to develop. Okay, and he has to keep very ordered in order to do that. We've got the idea of comparison, and the phrase compares the camera film being developed to the bodies in a mortuary and gives an insight into the speaker's emotions and the realities of what they experienced. Okay, that could be linked to the ordered rows and like lined up dead bodies, and that kind of just shows that what he had to experience during his time out there taking these photos. You then have the noun phrase of ordered rows again, which contrasts the chaos of the war zone. So he's home now, it's very ordered, it's very methodical, he's in control, but whilst when he was out in that war zone, obviously there was chaos. He had no control over what happened to those people, he just had to take the photo. Okay, so it's trying to contrast the difference between being there and being at home. You then have the verb of suffering. Okay, it could be his emotional pain that he's talking about. He's reliving this through having these camera reels set out, knowing what he's about to see again as they develop, but also the agonies that are actually physically captured in that image. So if you think back to when we were reading through the poem, he talks about that man who was dying and the crying of the wife. He could be talking about the suffering of people like that. You then have the metaphor of the spools of photographic film. Okay, these convey emotions that are locked in the images, very similar to when you link it into the verb of suffering. Okay, so it's comparing the suffering of the people within the in the war zone being trapped in that film forever. And then you've got the reels of film being described like soldiers, the ordered rows, or like rows of war graves. Okay, and it's a paradox of chaos and suffering, and that are reduced to something ordered. Okay, so what was once chaotic is now ordered and very controlled. Okay, so what I have done, as you can see, is I've picked out the techniques, I've picked out my keywords, and I just explained what those key phrases and words and mean, and therefore what we're meant to think about for this poet, this war photographer, and how he's affected by war. What I would like you to do now is pause the video for about 10 minutes, okay, and I'd like you to have a go with this quotation on your own. So remember to think about picking out your key words and phrases first, the techniques, and then explaining what they might mean. So pause now for about 10 minutes. Okay, so you should have worked your way through this quotation now. I'm just going to show you some things you could have picked out. You may have picked out other things to me, you may have picked out some more, who knows. But let's see what things you could have picked out. So firstly, I have picked these as the most important key words and phrases, and then I started to talk about what they might mean. So strangers, again, talks about it's about detachment. He has to detach himself from what he witnesses in the war zone because he doesn't know these people. They are strangers to him. Okay, and again, it reinforces the lack of control and that they are not there to help. They are there to take a photo. You've also got the fact it focuses on one photo and family makes it personal. So, sorry, one photo of family making it personal. So although the people are strangers, he's talking about one person in particular and his wife, which kind of brings a personal element into it to kind of emphasise the real suffering that goes on in these war zones, to make people realise that it's happening to families kind of just like them. They can't, and also talks about it's also showing that the war photographer can't truly forget and detach from it once they are home. Although they may be a stranger, it's still very personal in the fact that it could simply be someone happening to them. You've then got the metaphor of the half-formed ghost. Okay, it refers to the man's death and the photo not yet being developed fully. Okay, remember when we said the dark rooms, it wouldn't be instant. It's distorted. Okay, it's not quite there yet, so it's showing the haunting nature of the image coming to life before him. It could also reflect how they have been affected by the events that they witnessed. Maybe the photographer now is no longer whole themselves. They are different there compared to at home. Okay, they are not the same person. Then you've got faintly starts to twist. That links to the developing photo and the pain of the man in the image. So the twisting of agony of the man as he was photographed dying, but also the faintly starting to twist of the image actually physically forming in front of him. So these are just some of the things you could have picked out for this particular quotation. Okay, so now you need to go back to the one sheet revision page where you found those quotations, and you will find on there this section with questions on. Now what I would like you to do, based on the lesson so far and your prior knowledge of this poem, I'd like to try and complete this section of the page, please. So you need to answer these 3 questions and see whether you can figure out what Caroline Duffy was trying to criticise, to teach us, to warn us about, or to reveal and celebrate in this poem. Again, I'd like you to pause now for approximately 10 minutes, maybe 12, to work your way through these tasks, please. Okay, so you should have gone through this by now. So let's just have a little chat about, a little discussion about what you could have picked out. So why is it important to take pictures of war and suffering, even if it's hard to do so? Well, personally, you could have said it's important to show what is happening in other countries, to show what needs to be stopped, what people need to do to help, okay, just to kind of convey the message that is happening across the world. How can they be powerful? Well, they can make people stop, act and think about how they can help, how governments can step in and help, and it also shows, you know, the true suffering that's going on around the world and why maybe our problems aren't necessarily as bad as theirs. And then it asked you, Robert Capa, a Hungarian war photographer, said the desire of any war photographer is to be put out of business. Now, you could say that he it's because they don't want to witness those anymore, and also it would mean the end of war. They wouldn't need to be out there photographing these situations because the wars would be over. So they desire to have no job so that these wars aren't going on anymore and people aren't being harmed. Okay, so over here you can kind of cluster some of these together. So she could be criticising the public and the fact that they do not care for more than a split second once the photo is no longer in front of them. It could be criticising governments. It could be criticising our governments back home and how they aren't stepping in to help. She's probably there trying to teach and warn people about what is happening out in those countries, such as Phnom Penh, for example, that is mentioned in the poem. Okay, she's trying to teach us the suffering of others and what needs to be done. She's revealing the importance of peace and coming together and standing up. And also she's also trying to, you could say, celebrate the lives of those people that have passed, to kind of make it not be in vain, you could say, for example. And also to celebrate the brave work that these photographers actually do. Now, they're just some things you may have picked up on. You may, again, picked up on other ideas, and that's absolutely fine. Okay, so here we have an example exam question. So it says, read the following poem, War Photographer by Caroline Duffy, and then answer the question that follows. In this poem, Duffy explores the role of a war photographer. Explore how Duffy presents the impact of conflict in the poem and compare with one other poem of your choice. Okay, so you need to remember that in your actual exam, you will be expected to compare one poem from the cluster to another, and you will only be given a copy of one. So for this particular question, Remains is a good option for the comparison. Remains is a poem that you would have also done in school at the beginning of Year 9. Okay, so it's something you have covered. They are both about the impact of a war zone has on those that experience it. They explore memory and how people just can't forget what they experienced, and the events they come home with, what they actually bring home with them. What you may like to do before trying to answer this question is go over Remains in a similar way we've just gone over War Photographer today, by picking out key quotations, thinking about what they suggest about the impact of conflict and how people are affected by it. Okay. Now, before you actually start to answer this, there is extra support available for you on the school website. So if you went back onto the school website and went into Year 9 English Literature, Power and Conflict Poetry, you would find what we are calling knowledge organisers. Now, there is one for Remains here and one for War Photographer here. They give you lots more information on both poems. Okay, and this could help you with the comparison, especially if you want to revise Remains first. Now, when you're given this question, you need to remember that you don't have to speak about both poems equally. You can focus on one more than the other. Now, because we haven't had time to go over two poems in this lesson, if you are truly struggling to do a comparison this time, simply answer the question focusing on War Photographer for this practice. If you feel you can try and compare, I suggest you do, because then your teacher can actually give you some more thorough feedback. Okay, a few more tips and reminders for you to help you. So, reminder to use your PEA paragraphing. Now, some of you may have done what, how, why paragraphs of your teachers, and that is absolutely fine. You do that instead. Some of you may have been doing the PEA paragraphs, and again, you just follow that structure instead. As I've done PEA paragraphs, I've just put a reminder of what they are. So you need a point linked to the question. You need evidence with quotation marks, analysis of what the quotation means and suggests, word association, that's when we were picking out on our explosion the key words and talking about what they might mean. What is the deeper meaning of them? What was the writer's intention and effect on the reader? What were they trying to make us think and feel? And context, but make sure your context is relevant. Okay, some tips. You must answer the question given. So this asks you about the impact of conflict. Okay, so how does it impact on somebody? Okay, you need to talk about that. You must reference the poem or poems by using quotations. So if you are going to attempt the comparison, you need to reference both poems, and you can access remains on the school website. If you are struggling to do the comparison and you're just going to talk about War Photographer, you must reference that poem, and the poem can be found on the first few slides of this lesson. You must explore the effect of the evidence and the writer's intentions, and so what do they want us to think and feel? How do they want us to react? Okay, you need to link in relevant context. Remember I said do not just list random facts that you know about this poet or poem. Make sure they link in to the question and what you are actually saying, and comparing the poems. But as I've said already, if you're really struggling, just focus on War Photographer. These will help you hit all assessment objectives in the mark scheme if you do all of those things. Okay. Now what we are asking is that once you have completed this question, that you send it to your English teacher so they can give you some feedback and give you some tips on how to improve, and kind of pick out all the good things you've already done. Okay, so that is the end of our lesson, and hopefully you are able to answer this question. Keep well.